Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last and final panel of the event this year, How to Operate Ethical AI by Design. I'd like to introduce my esteemed colleagues that will be having this conversation together. And I will turn it over to them to give a more detailed introduction of who they are and what they do. Myself, my name is Lisa Thie. I'm the CEO of AMP Solutions, an AI ethics-focused consulting firm.
Thanks a lot, Liz. My name is Albena Kuyumjieva, and I'm Policy Officer at the European Innovation Council. For those of you who hear the first time, EIC is the biggest and the boldest innovation initiative of the European Commission with a budget of over 10 billion. What we do with all this money, we support deep tech, breakthrough innovations that aim to create new markets or disrupt the existing ones. And we support the startups at the very early stage of their journey to success. So they have to be high risk. We're looking at those bright and innovative ideas that are still not ready for market, but they have a great potential. And for the first time in the history of the European Commission, we provide not only grants, which all of you are probably familiar with, but the Commission provides equity. So in total, we can provide up to 17.5 million for a high-risk deep tech startup to innovate, to move fast, not to break things, and to become the next European unicorn.
Thank you. Jean-Gabriel?
So I am Jean-Gabriel Ganassia. I'm professor of computer science at Sorbonne University. So for people who knows Paris, it was Paris 6 University or University Pierre et Marie Curie. It was a scientific university, and my field of research is artificial intelligence. I was working on this field for many, many years now, I'm afraid. 44 years, which is impressive. Yeah,
You're only 43 years old. How is this possible?
Thank you. And so I was educated originally as an engineer, and I was working on AI, but when I was young, I wanted to study philosophy, and I study in parallel philosophy. And this was my hobby, my interest. But last few years, with the development of artificial intelligence, it appears that this interest of philosophy was very important. And so I was working on computer ethics. So what are the consequences of the social consequences of the digital, and how, as a philosopher, we can try to preclude the bad effect of AI. And I was also interested in what people call computational ethics, which means that we are using artificial intelligence technique to try to introduce some prescription in machine, moral prescription, so to be sure that the machine don't take bad decisions. So that doesn't mean that the machine will be moral, but they will act in conformity with some moral rules. And we are also working on other aspects. For instance, we have a project on compliance, how to make a machine that is compliant with, for instance, GDPR regulation or these kind of things. So these are examples, I think, of what we can do in computational ethics.
Thank you.
I think it's okay.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Fred Werner, and I come here wearing two hats. So I have my AI for Good hat, where I lead AI for Good for ITU. And I'm also head of strategic engagement for the Standards Bureau of ITU. Now, for those of you that don't know ITU, we're the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies, and we're also the organizers of AI for Good. And AI for Good was basically created on the premise that we now have less than 10 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and AI holds great promise to advance many of those goals and targets. So from healthcare to climate change to education for all, clean energy, spotting inequalities, autonomous driving, smart cities, robotics, what have you. I think the use cases are definitely there, but we also have to be mindful of the unintended consequences of AI. Of course, top of mind is job loss due to automation, but also if we're looking at machines or systems or algorithms that are making decisions for us or on behalf of us, we have to look at things like inclusive data sets and being mindful of bias, looking at ethics, especially when it comes to decision making in machines, looking at things like privacy, security, safety, of course being the UN, inclusivity, sustainability, and basic human rights being baked into AI systems is very important. And also, very importantly to ITU, will AI be used to further deepen the digital divide or bring the divide together? One could argue that the Global South has the most to gain from AI, potentially, but also potentially the most to use if they're not part of the whole process of development and decision making and all the things that are happening at warp speed around AI. So simply put, the goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the sustainable development goals and also figure out how to basically scale those use cases for global impact. And one thing I'd like to highlight as well is if you look at all these use cases, how do you know that an application works equally well on men or women, or on children or the elderly, on persons of different skin colors, people with disabilities, or in developing countries where things we take for granted, like electricity and connectivity, are actually issues? So these are things that don't occur naturally to the fast-moving tech and startup industry. I think it's more like, oh, let's build it and we'll fix it later. But they are things that we think about deeply in AI for Good. And also another issue is what is good. So what's good for me might not be good for my colleagues here. Different countries, cultures, communities have different ideas of what is good. And we could probably spend all day here trying to argue about what is good and not leave before Sunday or even longer. But luckily we don't have to start from scratch because we have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals basically a framework for deciding what is good. So it doesn't matter if you're a startup or a big tech or a researcher or you're just tinkering with AI. That is a very useful framework for deciding what is good and making sure we don't have to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch every time.
Thank you, Fred. I'd love to start off with our first question for the panel, which is, what are the issues and opportunities that you believe should be subjected to ethical AI by design?
I would go to, I think, what are the issues when we talk about ethics by design. I don't want to repeat everything that the audience, I'm sure, knows about the need for keeping human autonomy, privacy rights, accountability, transparency, traceability, and etc. What I want to focus on are what are the issues when we talk about ethics by design and how to implement it. Actually, what we very often see is that we are still having, in order to implement ethics by design, you have to have a team of ethicists, lawyers, and engineers. AI developers. And there we have three groups that still speak very different languages in most of the cases. And they can hardly communicate. In most of the cases, the AI developers have no clue what the ethicists are talking about. And then we add the lawyers, and then we have the perfect mix. And then and something that was already mentioned by my fellow panelists, we have teams that are not always diverse. I mean, we have less women in STEM, and that's quite a problem that we have to address. So we have this kind of Babylon Tower that has to implement one approach that is extremely important for our future. And then the second challenge is to actually being able to translate ethics by design principles in STEP in a very simple and comprehensive human language, which is also a challenge. Yet, the opportunities and the benefits of implementing ethics by design, I believe, are much higher than the challenges, because at the economic perspective, and I was very happy to hear all the panelists throughout the sessions that I attended agree that actually implementing ethics by design and human-centric approach is a competitive advantage. And it's becoming more and more clear that this is something that we need to integrate, not only to sell better the products, but also to ensure the uptake in the company or by the consumers. And most importantly, the biggest advantage of having ethics by design is to ensure that we have a future that we all want to live in and that we want our children to live in. And this is why it is super important.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think maybe because I was educated as a philosopher, I think it's important to try to define what we mean by ethical AI first, which is not obvious, and the second, by design. So maybe we can start by design, because the expression is very interesting, because it has two meanings in English. The first is intentionally, deliberately. So you want, clearly, to do some ethical AI system. So maybe this asks a second question. What are non-ethical AI systems? And maybe, so I agree with you, not with all of what you say, I would explain why. But you mentioned some abstraction, like transparency, like, I suppose, non-discrimination. You want to eliminate all kind of, well, yes, we agree with all these kind of things. But this is very abstract. And I think what is important is that each case is different. In a way, we say we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think it's the opposite. In our case, we every time have to reinvent the wheel because every AI system is different than the previous AI system. I think this is very important. And maybe this meeting between ethicists, between lawyer, between developer is difficult because they have to discover what is new. And this is the purpose of technology, is to make something which is very different. The problem, so when people start to study ethical issues related to AI, they say, oh, bioethics is a very good framework because there were people working on centuries on bioethics. But I think the problem is that bioethics is not appropriate for AI because the concepts are not at all relevant. For instance, you have 4 concepts. The first is the notion of autonomy. What does it mean to be autonomous? So in case of medicine, to be autonomous means, okay, we ask informed consent. So do you think that when you sign, you click the box that you agree with all the information, do you think you are informed, and do you think that this consent is make you really autonomous? So maybe the autonomy may be other thing, but you have to ask it. And the fact that, okay, you don't deliver poison, so you say non-beneficent AI tools, beneficent, yes, we all agree, sure. But the problem is, how do we know that some tools is non-beneficent? It's very difficult. You remember a long time ago, it was 20 years ago, maybe you are too young, but the first social networks, you remember, maybe?
MySpace.
So everybody were very happy. Young students in the best university of the world were building some tools to establish links between people. So it was very positive. And then we discovered the terrible effect of these social networks. So you see, it's very difficult to anticipate what are the effects of the AI technology. This is the difficulties. And so the notion of non-maleficency and beneficency is very difficult in the beginning. And concerning the notion of justice is very difficult. So first thing, first thing I said, you said intentionally, and you want to build some good AI system. But what are bad AI systems? So maybe we could start with this. For instance, generative AI, which is generating fake news. I think it's not good. Maybe sometimes it's good to have
I can also give you a very recent example from Spain. This app that was generating naked pictures of teenage girls. So the app was called, basically the advertisement was undress anybody for free. So that's definitely there is a problem with the objective.
Exactly.
So I think that where you're going with that is really important to think about. In the absence of regulatory frameworks, it's really hard to define your ethics and what you're trying to design around. So I think we have some learning lessons from the safety by design field by being really clear on what are the regulatory standards that we are trying to make sure that we meet. And with some of those structures in the AI Act, I feel like that framework really starts to give us some standards for that ethical AI
if I may,
guardrail.
so the notion of by design, I see the first meaning is intentionally, but the second meaning is by design. Is that in the beginning, when you are designing the tool, you need to take care of the effect. And I think, yes, one first point is very important. What is the purpose? What is your purpose? What is the purpose you will publish? And maybe it's different. And what is the actual use of the tools? Because sometimes you design a tool with a very good purpose, but the way people will use it will be very different. And so this is the beginning, but maybe you can ask, and after we shall have some
Yeah,
discussion.
I would love to learn more, Fred, from your perspective, especially with the framework of sustainable development goals, how you see ethics by design as a framework and different ways to operationalize that abstract concept.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And maybe just a bit of a disclaimer, I don't say the SDGs will solve everything. If you use the analogy, I think anyone who knows how to ski or ride a bicycle, what you look at is where you go. If you look at the road, chances are you go down the road. If you look at the tree, maybe you smash into the tree. So I like to think the SDGs is this kind of a guiding framework to keep everyone on track, but it's not going to solve all the issues you just talked about. And maybe if there's one thing that's maybe slightly encouraging, I don't think there's been a point in history where humans have thought so much about what it means to be human as right now, except perhaps the Greek philosophers a long time ago. And I think AI can be held up as a kind of mirror, where if you are designing any kind of AI, you're just confronted with questions all the time, like, what would I do? What would I do in this case? You have the trolley issue. You have, actually at ITU, they invented the Molly issue for autonomous driving. So you're faced with all these basically questions where you need to think step by step, what would you do? And that's how you end up with these different frameworks, and that's starting to shape a lot of these policies and governance frameworks that you're seeing accelerating at full speed around the world, which is also encouraging. So if you look at the EU Act or the Biden Executive Order or the UK Safety Summit or the UN, the high-level advisory body on AI, or in China, you have the governance. So you have all these processes happening at warp speed. And I think I've been to a lot of these events for the past 7 years, and I think there's a pretty good understanding of what the problems are, at least ones we know, because there's some, like you said, that we don't know and will come. And then there's a pretty good understanding of if you look at all these texts, and actually if you threw them all into GPT and said, give me an average, but there's more in common between all of these frameworks than there are differences. And I think we're at a point now where we have to look at implementation. How can you take these ambitious texts, these ambitious words, most of them are quite good, and turn them into action? And I think there's a huge gap in the ambitions of the text and the words and what governments and institutions and bodies can do. And there's a saying that goes, if you want to know the outcome of something, show me the incentives. And if you have, I don't know, a 25-year-old talented AI coder, and he has a choice to join a government body, to audit LLMs or go make $500,000 a year at Google, where do you think he's going to go? So I don't think the incentives are very well aligned. There's definitely an issue with skills gap, knowledge, expertise that needs to be built very quickly. But also, long-term, are the incentives there to actually turn those words into action? And I'd like to think that at least the summit that we're doing in May would try and address the implementation, or at least pathways to implementation. And maybe one thing, so we had Dr. Sala on stage just before us, and we had lunch together. And I think if you look at these texts, one of the big, without spelling it out, one of the big issues is basically, how do you know if something's true? If you have some kind of image or video or news, I was just in Davos myself, And when I came back on the train looking at my media and news, it was the first time in my life where I actually did not know what was true. There was just so many deepfakes, misinformation, and I'm someone deep in the topic. So imagine the person on the street who actually doesn't know. They have no way of knowing what's true. So one of the things we're going to be trying at the summit is actually to work on content authenticity, watermarking, deepfakes. How can you watermark not only images, but algorithms and data sets, and hopefully come up with some tools where if a government is trying to implement some kind of policy or regulation, that they'll have the means to do so. And I think it's going to be a collection of all these tools and techniques. Some might be standardized, some might not be, but I think we're at a point where we really need to focus on the action implementation part right now.
I'm in violent agreement with you on the need for to make things operationalized at this point. I think we've been talking about what vision we want for a good amount of time. And I think, to your point earlier, where a lot of these challenges come up is the lawyers are speaking in their language, the ethicists are speaking in their language, the computer science community and the engineers and the data scientists also speak a different language. So how do we start to harmonize some of those definitions of what the goal is and move that into practice? I'd love your guys' point of view on things that you've seen that have maybe idea generators for us as we go towards operationalizing this area for human-centric design.
So maybe I can begin. So the first step, as we said before, is to know exactly what we want to do. And maybe then it's important to have this interdisciplinary collegium, I don't know how to ask it, with some person from different perspective, which try to study this goal and say, okay, what are the constraints? And I have some experience. I didn't say before, but last few years I was member of different ethics committee in France, and especially some institution. And it's very interesting because we realize that they very naively they wanted to implement some tools which appears as external member of this company really problematic. And then we ask them to change the thing. So this is the first step, I think. And the second step, and this is the reason why we need to have some people who know how to develop, not only ethicists, not only lawyers, but to have people who are able to transform, to translate this ethical constraint in operational constraint, maybe to explain what should be the technical architecture, or maybe the flow of data, or these kind of things.
Or metrics for measurement to make sure
this is very important. This is the second step. And then after, in the company, the engineer have to implement this kind of thing. And the last step, I think, which is very important if we want that the people in the society trust the system, is to have some certification which is external to the enterprise or the institution. And I think these three steps are very important if we want to design or to build an ethical AI system by design, as we mentioned here. But I don't know if you agree with this, but I think this is very important.
I agree, but I also think there's a fourth step when you get into the private sector, which is you achieve what you measure. So how do we start to incentivize some of the executive leaders with compensation and true measurements on being able to look at some of these considerations from the beginning versus maybe cleaning them up later? But the concern that I have is, how do we even define what is ethical? I would love your point of view, Fred, looking across so many member states. There's some things that in one area of the world are very acceptable behavior, and others are very offensive behavior, for instance. How do you start to think about that as you're harmonizing some of these challenges?
Well, that's an easy one for me because we have our sister agency, UNESCO, who came up with a set of ethical guidelines and principles, and now they're moving from the principles to sort of use cases and looking at pathways forward for implementation. And it's very much founded in the principles of the United Nations and human rights and sustainability. So I think it's there. But as they say, the devil is in the details, and it's a very good starting point. But it's almost like the security, when you go through airport security, you catch most of the people who behave well. You'll catch the few crazy people, but it's the stuff that comes around that we're not going to see, and I think that's what you're talking about. So I think we still have a long ways to go about making what we have implementable, and I think users propose a pretty good step-by-step way of doing that, but then also still not ignoring the things that won't be caught by any amount of regulation or policy. And I think that requires different kind of thinking. And we'll see that. Sometimes those things take a long time. It's iterated step by step, and sometimes it comes out of nowhere, and users wake up, and there it is, a bit like generative AI 1 year ago. So sorry for that's not the great news, but the good news is there's a good starting point. And so indeed, that there is something to build on, and that's very much aligned with the UN. But I think there's still a lot of work to do to navigate that.
Yeah, if I may add, I actually don't think that we have problem of identifying which are the overall ethics values and what we consider ethical. We started 2019, there was a EU high-level group on AI that elaborated guidelines on trustworthy AI. We continued working with our colleagues and friends from OECD, from UNESCO and UN. So if you look at the overall principles, they are the same. I mean, I think they're universally agree. Of course, the devil is in the detail and how we translate the principles into very concrete and practical steps. For the Horizon Europe researchers and innovators, what we try to do is take these general principles that are accepted by everybody and translate them into step-by-step. This is what you have to do first, this is what you have to do second, and etc. But I want to touch upon another problem. If we think about bioethics, or I mean, if you look at the education in higher educational institutions, all medical students or social science students, they have ethical training. It's obligatory in most of the universities. What we don't have, and now we start slowly having it, is ethics for the applied science, for the computer science. And this is, I think, something that in the future will help us a lot understand each other and talk with each other. When we reach at the level that currently all the medical students have, that they know by default, I mean, they are drilled to understand the very first sign of red flags for unethical behavior. When we can reach this level, when we talk about anything on digital, then I think we will be on a very, very good track to go.
Yeah, I don't remember an ethics code being applied at engineering school. Are you seeing anything like that start to come around in terms of computer science and thinking through some of that equivalent of a Hippocratic oath?
Yeah, I think the first point, which is the most important, maybe you a little bit say, it's very difficult to code ethics. So the notion of code of ethics in a way is a little bit contradictory. So you cannot, ethics cannot just be expressed. So I agree with you. There are many principles, and we all agree on the principle. I suppose that you want to protect privacy. You agree with this? And I suppose that most of you want to be transparent. But when we are transparent, it's very difficult to protect privacy, depending on what you mean by transparent. This is very, very important.
Can I just say something? Because I'm always trying, I'm also an ethicist and lawyer, but I'm always trying to kind of see how I can simplify. And I did a lot of training on GDPR and data protection when the GDPR entered into force, and everybody was saying it's very complex ethics, privacy by design, and etc. And I said, listen, there is, as a rule of thumb, will you process your personal data, the data of your parents and your children, in the way that you want to process somebody else's data? If your answer is yes, without any doubts, then probably it's fine. So I think we can apply this principle with AI as well. I mean, if we because it's super complex, and we can make it even more complex than is. But finally, we go to the very basics of: do you want this AI application? Will you be happy to be used by your kids, by your parent? Do you want this AI tool to take decision on your behalf that you cannot change? And again, when the answer is yes, I think then it's pretty safe to say that it's probably fine.
Yes, but sometimes it's a little bit more complex because some people say, oh, I have nothing to hide, so maybe you can take my personal data. And if you generalize this, in some situation, it would be very bad because usually, okay, you have nothing to hide, but sometimes there is a problem. And so, for instance, a person has disease, he doesn't want everybody knows what is his disease. So I think it's very difficult.
No, it's definitely not easy, but if we have to have one rule, I mean, and we will end up with having much more, of course.
But what I wanted to say is that the principle, we agree on principle, but the principle are intention. And the difficulty with ethics is to find the good trade-off, the way to be happy with, because, for instance, another things, I suppose that you're against discrimination. But you know that European policy and many national policy wanted to promote inclusion, and especially women inclusion. But sometimes to do this, you have discriminatory. So this is an open question, and we need to solve exactly this problem. It's not impossible. What I think is important, and this is maybe what you say, in each particular case, we have to, and this is, I think, what is important with this ethical AI by design, the fact that we have to see what is the precise system we are building. The difficulty with technology is that the future is never what we anticipate. It depends new technology, but also it depends the way people are appropriating technology. And sometimes, and this is the case with social networks, they can make things we couldn't imagine in the beginning. And this is one of the difficulties. And the fact we mentioned, so we have to clarify the goal of the system, make it, publish it, and be transparent. And after, it is important to be sure that people are not reusing with other goals, because sometimes you have hidden goals in the system. For instance, maybe you want to survey the crowd in the street, but maybe the people will use this to do some facial recognition and to identify people or something like this. And we need to know exactly what is the purpose of the system.
Absolutely, and I think that especially in these kinds of instances, looking at it from different perspectives, this is where the diversity of thought comes in, especially as these systems are being designed. It's very intuitive for populations that are maybe targeted for discrimination to look around the corners of ways that platforms could be misapplied, where sometimes if you don't have that lived experience, it can be difficult to anticipate those challenges. So I think that's where we have to be really intentional in inclusion at the design level of these systems and these policies. Because in my experience, typically AI is often used to surface these kinds of challenges as well. So it's also operationalized for that content moderation and making those decisions. And so it will be very critical that we get clarity like we have today on all the different abuse types that we're looking for in order to make sure that we have universal alignment towards that goal. But I'd like to actually double back on the topic that you brought up earlier, Fred, which is in the area of deepfakes. Are we entering a post-truth era? And in that see it to believe it kind of mindset, how do you even start to structure ethics if we're not sure what ground truth is?
I think we're already there. At least when I came back from Davos, that was my personal experience going through the feed. And there's always both sides of the coin, and you probably heard a lot of that today. But if you go back a few years, maybe to 2007 or so, I like to think of the iPhone and social media platforms as our first contact with AI. And even though it wasn't really AI as we know it today, it was just basically optimized for engagement. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Everyone was happy taking photos, and now you see the consequences with self-image and depression and suicide and all these things. But now that we have a different kind of AI than that basic AI, if the incentives are right, you could really flip the narrative where maybe it's optimized for showing you the right thing at the right time according to your preferences and your lifestyle. And if somehow there was more money to be made from that than just optimized for engagement, then you would have a very different scenario. But the sad reality is the incentives are just not there. And it's the same with presenting truth or misinformation. I think there was an MIT study done a few years ago that fake news travels something like 10 times faster than real news, and then the damage is done, and then you have to correct. So I think the technology, it can be used for good or bad, and it's really an issue in alignment, but especially incentives. As long as there's more money to be made doing it one way than the other, I don't think anything's going to change, and I personally don't think any regulation is going to change either, because that's really, you can provide the guidelines of that and sort of encourage behavior, and there's many ways of doing that with taxation and incentives and plans and education. But at that core, it's basically what's the goal? Because it's always just going to follow the goal you give it to. And right now, the goal is engagement and money, and that's it. If you could make more money the other way around, they'd switch tomorrow. So how can we provide the incentives for that to happen?
That's very, very spot on. So the final question I'd like to ask to each of the panelists is, what do you think are the limitations of ethics by design in AI today?
That's a tough one. I think the current limitations, apart from the challenges that we already discussed here, is that essentially we have to always be aware that we can minimize risk, we can mitigate them, but risks will be always there. There will be always inherent risks. And we have to start understanding what are the inherent risks and how we can, and if we can live with them, and how we should handle them. So, and we also have to, apart from putting a lot of emphasis, and it's crucial on the design of the AI systems and techniques, we have to also put a lot of efforts on the user side. So we have to work in both directions to ensure that, first, to reverse to make the demand for ethically sound AI system much bigger than the demand for any type of other AI system. So the generation of profit for the companies will turn. And then also work as a society to ensure that the use and the applications are actually made for good. Of course, there will be always bad apples. It happens in all fields of our lives, but we have to create this kind of avalanche and the snowball effect where the good prevails and the ethics of AI prevails towards anything else.
Personally, I think that there are two limitations of ethical by design, or by ethical AI by design. The first is the conflict of objectives. Sometimes you have a company who has some objective which by themselves are not ethical. For instance, let's suppose that you have a video game or some social networks. They get money by trying to provoke some addiction to, and so it's very difficult to it's not ethical by itself, and so this is a contradiction, and you have many examples like this. Or for instance, the use of profiling. All the targeted advertisements are based on this notion, which is really problematic because it can be used for many just to send things which are not useful at all for the economy, and also this can be used by a political movement which try to disseminate an idea or maybe disinformation, etc. So this is the first point. And the second point, maybe it's corresponds to what you say, is the fact that once some AI system is used by many people, we don't know, and it's very difficult to anticipate the way people appropriate technology. And we have many examples. This is the reason why in the design of digital technology in general, we need to take into account the user experience. And so it's very difficult to do something by design when you take the user experience during the design of the system. So you see, this is an intrinsic limitation of the thing. And for almost all digital technology so I remember a guy say, everything is beta version. It means that we are redesigning constantly our algorithm, and this is what are doing everybody. So I think this is a strong and intrinsic limitation of this notion of ethics by design. So this is a conceptual limitation of this.
Thank you. Brett?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So I have 3 children. One's almost 18, and the youngest is 9. I think the 18-year-old will go into a world that's almost like we know it. Okay, there's a lot of technology, but probably do university, find a job, blah, blah. The 9-year-old, 10 years from now, I think we won't recognize that world. And that keeps me up at night. And I'm just trying to think, okay, there's limitations, but more on this practical side of what we need to build to basically adapt to that world that's going to go so fast. And you know what you were saying about how you have many disciplines where ethical training is just mandatory. But then I was talking, for example, to Dr. Sala this morning, and she has these PhDs who are working for her, building data sets of images, and a very simple thing, and these are very smart people, give us a gender balanced data set, and then you have the men who are basically guys who look like me, white guy in a suit, and then you have the ladies who are 20 years younger, like from a shampoo commercial, and that's coming from highly educated people. And it's not because they're good or bad people, they're actually really smart, hardworking, but it's just not a natural reflex to have that kind of inclusivity and ethics thinking into the design phase when we're building these data sets. And she has very good ideas on how to address that, and we'll be doing that at the summit. But I think it's that kind of thinking applying to people who are going to be, entering the workforce or working for governments, or I think it almost has to be mandatory because everyone's going to be exposed to technology and AI in one shape or form. And again, addressing that huge gap between understanding, skills, knowledge, ethical knowledge, whether you're in government or starting a university degree or a startup, really needs to address. And the speed at which this is happening is probably the thing that scares me the most, where when we started AI for Good in 2017, you could pretty much keep up with things year by year. And even back then, we're like, wow, things are fast. And then it was every half year, then it was every month, and now it's every week. I mean, there's a new breakthrough. And so I think that's the thing to really, probably the biggest bottleneck is going to be the education, the training, the skills, knowledge to keep up with the speed, or it's just going to run away from us like it already is.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, in a past life, I ran the AI for Good group at Intel Corporation, so I spent a lot of time in practice in this space. What concerns me the most is that privacy and safety are 2 sides of the same coin. And so you're always going to have to be balancing giving up some privacy for being able to adhere to ethical standards for platforms, and then whose privacy do you prioritize? Are you prioritizing the user? Or what if the user is a child and you go end-to-end encryption? Now are you prioritizing the privacy of the criminal over the child? There's always going to be these nuanced challenges. And as this technology keeps iterating as quickly as it is, I think it's going to be really hard for us to find those right balances and keep that conversation consistent, because it's not going to be a decision that's made today and then it can stand for 5 years. It probably can't stand for 5 months. So in a world where if we stopped iterating AI today, it would probably take 5 years to regulate what we have right now. How do we continue to stay current with making sure that people have the ability to make those nuanced decisions? That's what keeps me up at night.
Well, actually, AI can help. And we already can see here a lot of startups that are actually developing AI that ensures compliance, minimizes risks, or create a privacy layer where the researcher or the company will not actually have a touch of the real data. And this is where you can provide probably the win-win situation where you don't have to sacrifice the privacy towards, as opposed to ensuring ethics by design. It's complex, but I think the way that AI develops can be actually used for good, and we can have the AI policing other AI, and AI ensuring compliance of AI system that can actually work better for us.
I hope that vision is what executes, but I get concerned about things like what we're seeing with Meta with end-to-end encryption, the implications today. We are not using some of those technology trends like homomorphic encryption or confidential computing to do that. So I hope that we make advancements in that space.
I think I agree. I'm not so optimistic as you are. I think there is an intrinsic tension between the desire to be anonymous, to be free on the network, and the necessity to get information to be sure that people are behaving correctly. And this corresponds to all this tension between principles. Sometimes it's possible to solve them, sometimes, and I think we cannot solve them in abstract. We can solve them in concrete situations. This is the reason why I think the lesson, if there is a lesson, is that it is important to have a methodology to be able, in each particular case, to understand exactly how we can, what are the real ethical issues, and how we can translate this ethical issue in technical requirement, and then how we can certify for the public. Say, yes, we take this measure and we have this results which say, yes, you can trust in my system for this reason.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to open up to the audience. Does anybody have any questions for the panel?
I would like to hear your perspectives in terms of access to this technology across the world. So I imagine that northern countries will advance. You have augmented humans. What about the rest of the world? And what's your perspective on education about leveraging this technology?
So, yes, there are two questions. I think one comes from the fact that, so with digital and AI, so we are in a global world, but I think that ethical issues are different depending on the country. And I think it will be very difficult to solve this problem in general. I'm sure that in Asian country, the problematic are very different than they are. I remember we had a bilateral meeting between Chinese and French about AI, and I was in charge of discussing the ethical issue. And it was very funny because we had 10 minutes, and I had 10 minutes to explain, and this was a foreign affairs minister, and I say, can I say everything? No, we have to be diplomatic. And I say, nothing against your use of facial recognition, about social credit, etc. But okay, with this, and after the Chinese took 25 minutes to explain what he wanted, and I realized that we were in a totally different world, because they say, the evil in Western country is the fact we focus on the individual and on individual freedom. And we are good because we are a syncretic society where you have, and the K word in China is harmony. I think this is very, very different.
Yeah, I don't think privacy is expected.
Yes,
Most
exactly.
Of China
exactly.
isn't a design requirement.
And the second thing you mentioned, I think is very important, but maybe Albena told is about education. I think it's very important to educate designer, educate developer, but also, and I think it's very important, educate everybody at school about the danger of this information society, to understand that everybody has responsibility. When he gets information, he needs to confront with other information, not to trust everything. And the second thing is that when he disseminate information, he has a huge responsibility. I hope in the future we shall be able to educate people with all this kind of thing. Very soon, I think, at school, it's very important.
Well, I think that's the right note to end on, and we're at the end of our time for the panel. So please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today for sharing their perspectives.